Another live video. This time I'm going to do what I've done in the past and just be here for about an hour talking about just about anything anyone else wants to talk about, actually, with regards to integrated pest management or plants or their physiology or their transcriptome or maybe an insects or pests like proclivities or beneficial organisms proclivities. Really, I'm just here to do a question and answer video, really, for anyone who might have questions or want to check the variance on different answers they might have gotten in the past for certain things. For example, one topic of conversation that I think is often brought up, or at least for me is often brought up, is powdery mildew. So powdery mildew on cannabis and powdery mildew on various other plants. So there's this really interesting research report that I posted about a little while ago, within a month's time, I think. And it was really cool because this group of researchers, they were looking at Quercus, which is oak, Quercus genus, and they were looking at how it was able to be like a reservoir for the earliest powdery mildews. And they were looking at how powdery mildew genetics over time sort of indicates that the oak tree species might have been a very important, or at least the family in general that the oak is part of, was incredibly integral to the evolution of powdery mildews. Obviously, they didn't spring out of nowhere, and there were fungi that are ancestral to powdery mildews, right? And we're dealing with the progeny and the evolution of that. But the reason for this is because Quercus is pretty much the only genus that has so many different powdery mildew susceptibilities. A lot of powdery mildews are narrowly specialist. However, some of them are quite a bit more generalist. And some people believe, wrongly, that powdery mildew, the only powdery mildew that infects cannabis is one kind. And then they never say what species it is, at least in my experience. So I recently did a video on this called Golovinomyces sicariceum, and that's one species of powdery mildew that infests cannabis, but it also infests cucurbits, so things like cucumbers and squash, right? It also infests, if I remember correctly, tomato. But my point being is that you can end up in a situation where one kind of plant gets Golovinomyces, and then that plant then goes on to vector it to your crop plant, in this case cannabis, for example. So it's incredibly possible for plants that are not treated like crop plants, or plants that are not treated with any sort of antifungal agent or whatever your management program is for powdery mildew, it's possible that other plants on a property or nearby a property, maybe outside of your own property bounds, frustratingly, can vector the mildew to your plants. And, it's kind of frustrating because, obviously, even if you do everything right, if you're, for example, in an outdoor setting, you end up having this problem in which your pests and disease pathogens will be coming in from another person who might not be doing things correctly, or a group of people, rather. So you really need to sort of, if you can, if it's possible, it's very beneficial to establish a relationship with the people that grow plants around you, if you're in such a situation where that's possible. In a residential area that's possible, right? But even in a commercial setting, it's sometimes possible. At least in my experience, a lot of people who grow plants in greenhouses and such, or in like ornamental horticulture, they all kind of know each other, sort of. Not everyone knows everyone. Um, but in my experience, at least, especially people who are local, if they're big enough, they tend to know who their like competition is at least, or they happen to know who their colleagues are, if you want to call them that instead. And in some cases, it's more like we're all kind of in this together, or at least that's kind of the feeling I've often gotten from people. It's not always the case, and of course, at the end of the day, you are competing with people who are in the same niche as you. But if you can establish nice situations and nice communities, then you might be able to, as a whole, not deal with pests and pathogens. Because honestly, it works out better for you if somebody else is not dealing with a pathogen or a pest, and then having that get out of hand, and then that infecting everyone else, and then reinfecting you, because you might get good, but then they don't get good, and then that comes back to you. It's the same sort of like immunology problems that we see with like people who contract illnesses, right? Even if it's something as simple as like the flu, right? Somebody gets the flu, or somebody gets some infection and then passes it to somebody else, and then maybe it mutates or something in that person, and then somebody else who just got sick from the other person is now still susceptible because it's changed or something like that. Happens with plants too. But for those people who are joining now, well, all four of you, as Instagram is telling me, I'm here not to talk about Quercus or powdery mildew, but I'm here to talk to you about questions that you might have. And I just want to hold this space out for people who are interested in that, because that's just what the plan is today. So I'm going to just keep talking until somebody asks me a question. So that's your challenge. So let's see, what else to talk about? Well, I did talk about powdery mildew. Powdery mildews are the Erysipeles family. People who have seen me comment online have probably seen me use that phrase. Coast Now says that they dug my IPM talk the other day, and I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but I appreciate that nonetheless. Captain Pax, appreciate it. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to keep on going. So Erysipeles are the family of powdery mildews, and like I established before, they are known in a whole bunch of different plant families, and sometimes they are more specialized than others. Then there's the downy mildews, which are a totally different group of organisms altogether. They're actually what you would call Oomycota. Oomycota are kind of a fusion between fungi and animals, actually. They're not actually a fusion. I'm just using that as sort of a metaphor. What I mean to say is that they produce spores that have little flagella, and those flagella allow it to sort of move in water, for example. A lot of downy mildews, a lot of like Pythium, for example, is like this. So what you end up having a problem with is that the organism will traverse through the water. So if you have like a water splash, or if one plant's infected and you like pour water on it, or you irrigate it in some way, what can happen is that the spores can be transferred through the liquid medium, but they can also move as well somewhat. Obviously they can't like fly or anything like that, but you end up with that problem where in which the organism will move through the soil to your roots, and then other plants in the nearby vicinity. So like most plants aren't in nature planted with a banker, box. They're on the ground, so their infection likelihood is much greater than like if you have each plant in its individual pot. Although if it's in the irrigation system, you can get multitude of infections at the same time. So that's downy mildews and powdery mildews, and I guess I could talk about viruses. Viruses are a thing that a lot of people don't often ask me about, because like 90% of the people who follow me grow cannabis, which is no problem. But in agriculture, there are a ton of viruses. And I only make that point because in cannabis, there are also viruses that infect cannabis, but the research is much more lacking for obvious reasons. But we do know that there are some. In other plants, though, there are tons. There are tons of other viruses, and they're vectored by insects, or they are not vectored by insects at all. They are, in fact, vectored by, like people. People could touch the infected plant and then transfer it to another plant. This is very common in, like, tobacco mosaic virus. That's why they say that, like, people shouldn't handle tobacco products and then also handle organisms that can be infected by the tobacco mosaic virus, because the virus is still possibly active even in that tobacco material, which is pretty impressive, to be honest. That's a really incredible feat, if you ask me. But some viruses are going to be really, really noxious to a cultivator because they can do things like make all of the ripe fruit unripe. They can do things like gnarling the plants. They can pretty much make sure that an entire crop is useless, or yields are like 90% less or something like that. So they're very much a travesty. But at the same time, we've been finding that we can use viruses or their genome as an inspiration for other interesting green technologies. Studying how they infect allows us to understand what about the plant physiology is being exploited, and then how you can reduce that. So, for example, like in a computer. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the virus. So El Totago says, crazy for a virus to be able to survive in smoke. It's not the smoke necessarily, it's just the product. Like somebody might take like dipping, or like chewing tobacco, chewing tobacco, and then like touch the plant. That's usually how it happens, or in cigarette tobacco or something like that. That's how that happens. Where was I going with that? But you do run into a problem with viruses because they are so destructive, but you can utilize an analysis of how they infect, and then you can understand how they exploit the plant. Very similar to how you would, for example, go about fixing an exploitation in a computer, in a computer software program. So if you had somebody who was like hacking your software or whatever, they might know a specific exploit, a specific code of data or something that allows them access to the software, or allows them to maybe redirect some information, or allows them to read information that they should normally be able to read, or something like that. In a very similar way, plants are just, or all biological organisms are kind of like large biological computers, and our genome is like our code. So if you understand that in some plants there are mutants that lack certain code, that the virus needs to exploit that code in order to be effective at infection. If you take out those genes, you don't have to add any genes necessarily. Sometimes you can just remove them, and then you no longer have a purchase for the virus to like grab onto. And I'm being metaphorical here, but I think that makes sense. El Totago says, yeah, makes more sense for it to be, in the plant matter. Yeah, if it was able to, like, survive being, like pyrolyzed, I mean, that would be really impressive. That would be incredible. I would probably name it like one of the best organisms in the world, better than the tardigrade, the water bear, for being able to survive extreme conditions. That would definitely go to a virus that could do that. That could just withstand incineration. But some viruses, so like, there's been a ton of research on viruses. But I'm getting a question, so I'm going to shut up. Captain Pax asks, or says, we grow a lot of mint, and I believe some of our plants have a virus. Some have yellow or brown spots and don't grow correctly. Good info, looking into it more now. Okay, so maybe you have a virus. It's possible, but it might also be possible that you just have a little bit of like a microbe, well, viruses are microbes, but you might have like a fungal or bacterial problem too. A lot of people aren't aware of these, or I mean, a lot of people are, but many people don't talk about them, so some people are not aware of them, which is just convoluted. So what I mean to say is that there are these things called Koch's postulates. There's a guy named Koch. Some people call him Koch, but that's not how you pronounce the name. It's German. It's Koch, Koch. If I'm remembering correctly. There should be, yeah, it's Koch, Koch, yeah. So, Koch's postulates are a methodology by which you can verify whether something is what you suspect that it is as a microbe, as an infectious agent. Because humans typically can't just look at a plant and take a look at the symptoms. Some symptoms are unique and diagnosable, and they're distinctive, and they're what are called diagnostic. But other plant symptoms are not. They're diagnostic agnostic, or they're generalized, or they're not symptomatic, or they're asymptomatic when they have no symptoms. So the problem that you end up with is that you've got multiple different infections that can look very similar, but you don't know exactly what the species is, or you know what the genus is, but it's really a complex of different species, and maybe you have maybe not just one infection, but you might have multiple infections. You might have a primary infection that's causing most of the damage that you're seeing, and a secondary opportunistic infection that's happening because it's already damaged, the plant that is. And you can run into that problem too. Certainly with viruses, for most of human history, that's been a very difficult thing to kind of do, and obviously as people are wont to do, they will blame things like demons and spirits and bad luck and scorn and witches and things like that, because we didn't really understand how it all worked, but now we do. Now we understand that witches and magicians were really just people who could manipulate viruses. What they really were druids. I'm just joking. Captain Pack says that we spray fungicides frequently, so I want to say it's not a fungus. Could be bacteria. I believe it's caused by an infection from aphids. Okay, that's interesting. If you're spraying a lot of fungicidal agents, it's possibly not that. But like different modes of action for different fungicides might be more or less effective versus other fungi. So it can be a little bit difficult to tell. But yeah, if you're preventatively treating for what would normally infect your mint, then that's probably a safe bet, right? So besides Koch's postulates, you've also got like Occam's razor. And for anyone who's not aware of Occam's razor, it's a sort of a logical axiom. So essentially, the simplified version is the simplest answer is usually the correct one. A less simplified version of that is the answer that you have to make the least amount of assumptions to come to the conclusion of is more likely to be correct, which I think is my favorite way to put it, because people will oversimplify the word simple, and they think, oh, it's the one with the less words, or it's the one that like I can say the easiest, but that's just fallacious. What I really mean is that, or what the razor really states is that if you believe there's a problem, how do you come to a conclusion without like too much, without knowing everything that's possible, because nobody knows everything that's going on. But if you have to make less presumptions about one conclusion than the other, it's more likely to be that one, because you don't have to consider that one as mysterious, and you don't have to worry about all the other different contingencies that go along with it. And when it comes to deducing whether or not a plant pathogen has infected a plant, or even whether or not, if you know there's a pathogen, or you strongly suspect there's a pathogen, what pathogen it is, sometimes you can't deduce it without laboratory analysis. which is sort of an unsatisfactory answer. I get a lot of questions from people, a lot of pictures where people are like, what is this? What's going on with this? Do you know what this is? And if it's like browning or yellowing, I really can't tell always. I don't have the context to be able to tell necessarily. A lot of biotic pathogen symptoms look like abiotic pathogen symptoms. Or not pathogen symptoms, rather. A lot of biotic pathogen symptoms look like abiotic problems. So, like, it could be that your yellowing is caused by a pathogen that's choking the life out of your plant, like Fusarium wilt. Or it could be like the sun. Maybe you got sun scalded, or maybe the sun's too hot, or the lights are too hot, or maybe, or too close rather. Or maybe the plant's drying out and desiccating, or maybe something about the amount of light it's getting is messing with its concept of what season it would be. Not that it really has a concept, but you know what I'm trying to articulate. Maybe it thinks that it's time to flower when you really don't want it to, because it's not where it should be in its developmental cycle, for example. What do you prefer for prevention of botrytis, if not trichoderma and genetics? So for botrytis cinerea, the gray mold, I would have to say that for treatment, it's very difficult. If you happen to get it when you're not in flower, with cannabis, for example, then one thing that you can utilize is sulfur powder, micronized sulfur. That's what some people utilize. And it's useful because sulfur is an incredibly fungicidal agent. Although one of the problems with using sulfur is that it's also an insecticidal and a mitocidal agent. So if you've got bad insects, mites, and fungi, then you've got the trifecta, and you can use the sulfur for all of them in one fell swoop. But at the same time, if you're using biocontrol agents that are mites or insects, then the sulfur will also negatively impact those organisms. So in an integrated pest management system, you need to consider all of the different factors and everything that's working together in harmony. And you want to make a holistic sort of answer to your problems. But that doesn't necessarily answer your question, because you were asking like for prevention, and that's more of a treatment, more of a curative treatment. So I would say that, like a lot of pathogens, the best defense is avoidance and exclusion, which are cultural controls and environmental controls. So controls that have to do with the disallowing of the pathogen to come into your grow space. If you're growing outdoors, however, that's a tall order and not necessarily possible. If you're growing indoors, it is a little bit more possible and a little bit more feasible. As far as products are concerned, there are biological microbes that are sold as a preventative, and I've seen the data on them. Like, for instance, for some trichoderma products, like you're asking about, but I know a lot of people who pay a lot of money for microbial bioinsecticide or biofungicides rather, and bioinsecticides, and they don't actually see the benefit from them. And, you know, I'm not always with them 24/7, so I don't necessarily know what's going on. It could be that they're not applying it correctly, and they don't realize that because they're not the ones applying it. It could be because the botrytis was particularly virulent. It could be because it established in a place where the spray didn't get a lot of coverage on, and then maybe they didn't apply it enough after that. There's a multitude of possibilities. And I would say it's very important that people don't necessarily utilize a product, have it work incorrectly one time, and then come to the conclusion, oh, well, this doesn't work, this is snake oil. Because that's not necessarily true. And sometimes it's as easy as, oh, I didn't know that I can't apply this and that at the same time. Sometimes it's a much more esoteric reason. And I've certainly been in the situation where I've applied something or I've utilized something, and it didn't work out, but it works out for other people, and I have to take that into consideration. I don't think that there's some conspiracy where those people are just like saying it works because they're getting kickbacks or something. It's more likely that I'm doing something wrong, or that I misunderstood some part of the procedure, or possibly it's just really difficult to control in a certain geographic area. And a lot of the problems that the worst answers that I can give to somebody is, I don't know, or even more frustrating, there's nothing you can do about it, possibly. Because of your geographic range, it's possible, like in some places, for example, I have an anecdote about this. And I guess I'm just going to ramble here at this point. Hopefully I have answered that question. But, so there's a ornamental grower that I've worked with in the past, and they had a problem in which they were applying a fungicide for powdery mildew. And they were applying this fungicide. It was like, it's not like a biofungicide. It was a chemical, synthetic chemistry fungicide. I want to say it was something like, no, I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyways, they were applying this fungicide, and it wasn't working. And they were applying it right on, and it just was not working. So the fear was that they had a resistant population in their greenhouse. And that would have been very, very terrible. Very terrible to discover for the people making the product, and a very terrible discovery for the people who were trying to get rid of this powdery mildew. It ended up being that that was not the case. The problem was that the person who was applying the fungicide wasn't getting enough coverage. And they were very defensive about like that aspect of it, because part of the company culture was that if you made a mistake, you were lambasted quite a bit. And this is where the story goes from being an anecdote about the application of a treatment to why you should treat your employees well. Because if there wasn't such a culture of fear for the employer, or for the employee rather, then they might have come up and like honestly said, hey, maybe I'm not spraying well, or maybe could it be me? Because as soon as they admit that possibility, they become a target for ridicule, and they become a target for termination, or being called out, or some sort of a reprimand. All of those factors were probably going through their head. So anytime somebody thought that they were doing something possibly wrong, they were totally tight-lipped about it. Which makes my job difficult, because if you're trying to find out what the problem is, and you're not going to like hurt someone's employment over it, you're just trying to find out, trying to inspect what the problem actually is, and it could be multiple factors. If somebody lies like that, it makes it much more difficult to find that out. And if you start with the assumption that everyone's doing everything correctly, then you might miss what is actually a really important factor. Like, maybe somebody didn't spray as well as they could, or maybe somebody sprayed in the wrong area, and that was the confusion. Who knows? If you're coming out from as an extrinsic force looking in, there's a ton of context that you're lacking. And if you're embedded in a group for quite a bit of time, you gain a lot of that context. But you would never gain that context if you didn't embed yourself into that group for a period of time. So it's hard to say what's wrong in a lot of places without a ton of context. And it's also hard to tell what the problem is without that sort of context too. If I didn't know that somebody was spraying a fungicide and they had a problem that looked like a fungal disease, possibly, or some fungal diseases, then I might come to that conclusion if I didn't already have that context. For those people who are joining, I'm basically holding this space for people who want to ask questions. That seems to be the most popular thing that people want to do on the live feed. So I just wanted to, since I had some time, be here for answering some questions that people may or may not have with regards to IPM and other sorts of things related to plant cultivation. Certainly, I'm not opposed to other questions and comments and things like that, but that's mainly what I'm holding this space for. General Mombi asks, what specific strains of trichoderma are the most beneficial in combating fungal infection? Oh, I mean, like, I guess that's not really... Harzianum is the popular one, right? So, I mean, I assume you mean isolates and strains and, like, what exactly... So, like, there's a ton, there's, like, thousands. There's thousands that exist. And commercially, there's, like, there's quite a bit of multitude. And it depends on where you live and what are accessible to you and all of that sort of regulatory import that sort of modulates how one would answer this question. But I would say that I don't actually know what the most beneficial are because it's context dependent, I suppose you could say. You do make a good point about Trichoderma harazineum, but I think that doesn't... I mean, fungal infection is not, like, all-encompassing. It's, it's not just... You should check the label for the microbes, or for the antimicrobial or antifungal biopesticides, because they don't go after every fungus imaginable. They have specific fungi that they go after. So that's an important qualifier for that. So I don't really know. It depends on the fungus you're trying to treat. And I think it also depends on the crop, because certain crops do or don't get certain infections. Laughing Shaman asks, do you have a preference between conventional or organic farming methods? Like, do I prefer organic farming over conventional farming? Is that the question? And Tatago says, yeah, once a plant is susceptible, a bunch of different things will hop on. Yeah, that's true too. What's up, Matthew? What's up, you, OGK1911? Laughing Shaman qualifies with over synthetic salts and chemicals. Oh, I mean, like, okay, so that's what you mean. Because I wouldn't have gotten that from that question, because just because, conventional means different things to different people, and don't I know it, organic means different things to different people, so I always have to ask for more detail, because if I assume that someone means organic based on, like, the EPA or the FDA, like, designation of organic, the OMRI or whatever, that's way different than, for example, somebody who thinks that, like, OMRI is foolish and it doesn't go far enough, or some people think it goes too far, and everyone has sort of a different opinion on that. Usually there's a big split between, like, producers and consumers with regards to what's actually organic and what's not. But I mean, I definitely prefer... What I prefer is the system that has the smallest footprint for the local environment, for detriment, but that also produces the best quality of product. And you can't necessarily do that. I feel like a hybrid system is important. And with technology, so, like, that's a good question, because I think it really... how do I put this? It really segues into a great conversation about different places and their regulations, and also what's normal for different countries, different geographical zones, for the development of certain plants and cultivation of certain plants. And Yeah. So for people so somebody's calling me out for having this assault gun. This is a little gun that spring shots salt um, to kill flies and other sorts of things like that. Laughing Shaman says, I figured you would say hybrid because you were concerned with results more than philosophy, which yields profits over quality, which I agree with. Okay. I mean, like, um, I would say that, like, a big important part of that is that, like, in another video that I made, I mentioned that um, IPM can't, or rather, all agriculture is detrimental to the uh, the local environment, the local ecology, and the problem with that is that it really comes down to mitigation of that footprint. So if you are in a field, you have to clear the field. If you're in a forest, you have to clear the forest. You can't not clear the forest and expect a certain yield. It's just not realistic. And if you're like in the ancient days, then your options were limited, and you might not have even considered the fact that you might be harming the local environment or anything like that, because that sort of knowledge and information didn't really exist, not in like the way that we understand it now. He's saying some people instantly shut down conventional ideas if they aren't up to their definition of organic or natural. So does regenerative farming not exist? Oh, okay, that's a good question. So, well, let me segue to what I was going to say before. For example, in like in Holland, it's a very small country compared to like the United States of America, where I reside. And even considering California, the state, the province where I reside, and they are super duper horticulturally invested, and it shows in their government spending, it shows in their professionalism, it shows in the sorts of products that they make. And I'm a little bit biased, but I bring it up because not only are there different regulations and different normalcy, you also run into a better grasp of the new technologies that are coming out that allow somebody to be conventional and have less of a ecological footprint in certain aspects, not all aspects, but certain aspects. And of course, when you break it all down, there's the product that you're making and on site and all that. But if you have to bus in a bunch of workers, or if a lot of your workers get injured, or if they're exposed to a lot of pesticides in the future or at the current time, and then they develop some exotic cancer 30 years down the road, it's hard to say what the footprint is actually going to be until like all the consequences happen, and sometimes the consequences are still far-reaching, and even now. Obviously, agriculture it happened at one point or multiple points in history around the globe, and then continues on to this day. So the consequences of agriculture and the agricultural revolution are still happening now. But I bring up Holland for that reason, because different places have different priorities on what's okay and what's not. In America, there are a lot more people on like different scales of like, I guess you could say, like establishment and like in technology. So like people could have greenhouses that are sort of low tech, and they can still manage to be more or less economical and as a business be successful. However, in Holland, you don't see a whole lot of like low-grade, low-tech greenhouses. You have like high-tech, high-fidelity, high technological prowess. You've got a lot of really interesting systems, new methodologies, new research on pathogens and pests and things like that. At least that's been my experience, not working in Holland, but working with people who are from Holland and in Holland and the Netherlands and places like that all the time. So, to answer your question, yeah, conventional, I think, is sort of like what it means is always changing, and what organic also means is always changing, because those same people who are conventional are also using a lot of really important, are making a lot of really important changes. Some of those changes are things like having their substrates and their other products be biodegradable, and in that way people can reduce their footprint on the environment. That's a huge thing. But they're still doing things like constructing greenhouses. I mean, the land is already cleared, but it was cleared and it wasn't clear at some point in history, so that land is still being replaced. As far as your question about regenerative farming not existing, I'm not a regenerative farmer, but my understanding is that regenerative farming as a concept is totally and similar to what I'm saying already in practice. It's more on a gradient, so where you reside on that gradient depends a lot on what your resources are and where you are and what you can do and what you're growing and that sort of a thing. Certainly, like, if you take my point about how all agriculture damages the local environment to an extreme, then you could say that, like, in no way does agriculture ever come about as regenerative, because you don't have that replacement of the original biota or the original ecosystem or any of that sort of stuff. But I think that that's sort of missing the point, because my point is not that you can't grow plants and cultivate food and other luxury items like spices and things like that, and like because you have to like clear land that suddenly you're this terrible person. I don't think that, and I don't believe that, and that's not what I mean. And I appreciate that you think those are great answers. Thank you. But what I do think is important to consider is that you know, it is mitigation. It's not perfect and it's not 100%, and you can't possibly have that because the Earth is finite, right? And so the population is continuing to grow, and it's really important for us to be as regenerative as possible, but it doesn't mean that we're like going to go back to subsistence farming necessarily. It doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily like grow within like jungles or anything like that. I'm not saying that doing those sorts of things in some capacities aren't bad. It's just that there are a lot of logistical reasons for why that is, and it's not necessarily like just unrespectable. You know what I mean? I struggle to find solace in the morality of any one single agricultural method. There isn't a 100% regenerative method I have seen. Right, because for it to be 100% regenerative, in my opinion, I feel like that would require things to go all the way back to how they were. And how far back are you going to go? Are you going to go as far back as before the first humans cultivated that land and developed it? Do you know what it even was like? People don't have like genetic records. They don't have they don't have field data that like shows you like, oh, we had this many native bees and we had this many diptera and we had this many coleoptera and we had this many hemiptera. They don't have that information, so there's no way to know, for one. And for the other, environments are constantly changing too. That's not an argument for just being like, who cares, things change, like whatever. We shouldn't be flippant about it, but at the same time, we should also be respectful that things are changing and they are always changing. And people like to throw around the phrase stewardship. I threw around the word stewardship recently, and I think that it's an accurate term because we're sapient creatures that are able to think about that sort of a thing. Whereas another animal or microbe or something isn't going to be thinking about that sort of a thing. Like, you know, pests and pathogens, they don't, you know, so there's this terminology called extirpation. Extirpation is localized extinction. So all that means is that in a localized area, a certain organism ceases to exist. It may also exist in other places too, and it might repopulate the area. But for this local area, there's an extinction event about a certain species or multiple species or something like that. And the reason why that happens is because you don't have powdery mildew going onto these plants and thinking to itself, maybe I shouldn't kill this one. Maybe I should farm this for a long time. Because they're not thinking about it. You don't have leaf beetles going in and eating the leaves of all these plants and then going, I'll eat this plant, we'll all eat this plant, and we'll lay our eggs on this one, and we'll make sure not to damage the seeds so that it can grow again. They're not thinking about that. They're just eating as much as possible, and if they just happen to not be destructive enough to kill all of the plants in the local area, then their progeny will have food. Obviously, you have other predators that come in and balance that out, and it's this very complex weave, this web that they weave together of the trophic levels and gradients and things like that. Stewards of the land, stewards of the plant. I'll smoke to that. Well, you smoke to that. I think that's a very great sentiment to prosit, to cheer to. It's it's something that we all have to consider, and it's hard. I also don't think it's very useful to shame people also, because they don't necessarily have control or very much control over how they eat or where they get it. I do know that certainly people who eat vegetables more than meat, or they don't eat any meat or something like that, they can, vegetation tends to cost a lot less than meat products, but not always. And it's not always filling. Some people have different dietary restrictions. You get into this problem about like choice and what people are allowed to do and agency, and that becomes sort of a social question that is far removed somewhat from agriculture in general. Let me put this down here. Laughing Shaman continues to ask really cool questions and statements like, so then the best solution we can come to at this point is to mitigate any potential environmental destruction to the best of our ability. Is there any way to be in tune? What do you mean by in tune? In tune? What do you mean? I just mean an evolved form of what nature already does, like you just described. I guess not right now is the best answer I have for that question, because I'm going to get geeky here. Hopefully you're okay with that. My favorite video game series is the Metroid series, the Metroid saga. Samus Aran, and she's a bounty hunter, space bounty hunter, but that's not important. What's important is that she was raised by this alien race of bird people called Chozo, and they were depicted as this race of beings that were technologically advanced, so technologically advanced that they screwed up their own world, foreshadowing, and then they became so technologically advanced in other worlds that they, instead of trying to dominate those worlds with tech, kind of like Coruscant in Star Wars where everything is urban, they wanted to sort of use their advanced knowledge of nature to sort of have this like you say, sort of what I assume you mean by like an in-tune sort of like living with the trees. Instead of making a bridge, they had a tree and they made that tree into a bridge. And all this sort of low-tech and high-tech hybrid sort of way of living. And it's only possible because they had such a high degree of understanding of natural sciences and history and things like that. A non-think a non-think method. Like a Mushin, sort of like no mind, like way of going about things. Oh yeah, I'm familiar with Dragonfly Earth Medicine. So like, yeah, so for example, like homesteading, right? I appreciate, yeah, okay, good. Apparently I'm being vindicated that I got what you were trying to talk about here. Yeah, so I think it's possible. I think it's way less possible in some environments and way more possible in other environments currently, and that may or may not change in the future depending on how things go. Um, because honestly, people were doing something sort of like that a long time ago, but they were doing that because it was a long time ago. And they didn't have the high tech to like kind of pollute necessarily. They had other ways of pollution, assuredly, but not necessarily the manners in which we do it now with like crude oil and all kinds of stuff. I don't have to like go into too much detail there. But I really do believe that an increase in technological mastery, which is sort of a vague term, but I mean like an understanding of like genetics, an understanding of machinery and physics and the natural sciences would possibly allow us to do like what the Chozo were able to do in that fictional video game, the ability to sort of become a steward. And I'm not the first person to think this. It's like there's the is it Dyson? I forget who the sci-fi author was, but they talk about like tiers of societies, and like right now we're like tier 0, tier 1, and there's like 9 tiers, and like the higher up you go on the echelon, the greater a command of basically universal physics you have. And the first level is like being able to terraform and being able to control the environment perfectly or mostly perfectly on one planet. And then having that ability allows you to basically cultivate the planet as you wish. But, they don't ever go into the details of, like, does that mean that you're conserving all the species? Are you only letting a limited number of species exist? That's sort of up in the air, not really gone into detail. Cheddar Bob 13 asks, is this an Ask Anything forum, or is there a discussion topic? And Laughing Shaman says, aside from tillage, were there any major ag practices that were negative in past ancient methods? Oh, of course, absolutely. I'll answer the first question first. You could ask other questions if you'd like. I may or may not respond, but mostly I'm talking about integrated pest management, plant cultivation, but send me a question and I'll decide if it's appropriate or not, I suppose. And Frank Bird asks, what would be the most effective method in getting rid of aphids or black flies? Well, I've never heard of them called black flies, unless you mean a totally different organism. Electro-horticulture. Not familiar. Maybe I will learn something on this live stream. Tell me about electro-horticulture, Cheddar Bob. And for Laughing Shaman, an example of something that was ancient. I mean, like eutrophication. People who don't know what eutrophication is, it's when the runoff of livestock or plant fertilization, all of their food, all of their manure, all of that organic material, when it rains or for whatever reason it gets transferred into lakes and rivers and streams and oceans, you have this bloom of microbial activity that sucks all of the oxygen out of the water and then kills everything that's in there. And that's usually eutrophication in a nutshell. And you better believe that was happening, back in the day, way before we had mechanization of agriculture or anything like that. Maybe not to the degree that it was, but it was definitely possible because we were growing livestock, and we didn't necessarily grow livestock always. We weren't growing them growing them. We weren't cultivating them. We weren't raising them in cages necessarily in the same fashion that we do now, but it's certainly a thing that happened. And of course there was the clearing of trees and forests and things like that. We still did that. Again, not to the level and degree that we do now, but those things also happened. And There's definitely examples, although nothing specifically comes to my mind. In China, for example, redirection of rivers, which also happened in other places, but that occurs to me because I used to live in China, and I guess that just occurred to me. So the redirection of rivers and streams and things like that, and the damming of rivers can also lead to negative effects that we didn't do like the research trialing to figure out what that would be. So there's no way that we have an idea of like how much damage that really was. You know what I mean? Chatterbob expands with using the Earth's natural electric current to stimulate plant growth. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, I'm not necessarily... well, what's your question exactly? Yeah, are you asking if it's like legitimate? I don't get it. Frank Bird asks, maybe, but have you heard of any practices of aphids prevention as well as how to get rid of it if you're infested? Sure. Yeah.